Jack Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at the pink slip in his hand. After 8 years of construction work, the machines had finally taken his job. The company said they could build houses faster and cheaper with robots. Jack crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash can outside the construction site office. He walked to his old pickup truck and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. The radio was playing the same news story that had been on repeat for 3 days, something about aliens coming to Earth to hire humans for jobs in space. Jack had heard bits and pieces, but he never paid much attention to space news. He had bills to pay and a family to feed. The drive home took him. Through the center of Las Vegas, traffic was worse than usual. People were talking on their phones, pointing at something in the distance. Jack looked where they were pointing and saw it. A massive white dome sat in the desert outside the city. It was bigger than any casino and seemed to glow against the brown mountains. Jack pulled into his driveway and found his wife, Maria, watching the news on their old television. Their 2 kids, Carlos and Sofia, were doing homework at the kitchen table. Maria looked up when Jack walked in. "How was work?" she asked. Jack held up the pink slip. Maria's face went pale. "They let me go," Jack said. "The robots can do my job now." Maria stood up and hugged him. "We'll figure something out, we always do." Jack nodded, but he wasn't so sure this time. Construction was all he knew. He had dropped out of high school to help support his family when his father got sick. He learned to build things with his hands, not his brain, on the television. A reporter was standing in front of the white dome. She was explaining that aliens called Zephyrians had come to Earth with job offers. They needed workers for something called deep space mining. The pay was more money than most people could imagine. "Look at that," Maria said, pointing at the screen. "They're saying the aliens will pay each worker enough money to buy a house and send the kids to college." Jack watched the news report. The reporter said the aliens were looking for humans who could handle long trips through space. The work was dangerous, but the money was incredible. They would pay each worker $1 million for a 2-year contract. $1 million. Jack said quietly. "That's more money than I'll make in my whole life." Carlos looked up from his homework. "Dad, are you going to work for the aliens?" Jack laughed. "I don't think they want someone like me, buddy. They probably want smart people, scientists and engineers." But that night, Jack couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the $1 million. He thought about Carlos and Sofia. He thought about Maria working 2 jobs to help pay the bills. He thought about his old pickup truck that needed new tires. The next morning, Jack drove to the unemployment office. The line was longer than he had ever seen it. Everyone was talking about the aliens. Some people were excited. Others were scared. Jack waited in line for 3 hours just to sign up for unemployment benefits. On his way home, Jack drove past the white dome again. This time he pulled over and parked on the side of the road. The dome was even bigger up close. It hummed with a sound that Jack had never heard before. The walls seemed to move like liquid, but they were solid when he touched them. There were people everywhere. Some were camping in tents, hoping to get a chance to meet the aliens. Others were just curious. Jack saw reporters from all over the world. There were protesters too, holding signs that said things like "Earth for humans" and "Don't trust the aliens." Jack walked closer to the dome. There was a line of people waiting to get inside. The line was organized by security guards who looked like they were from the military. A sign next to the entrance said, "Galactic Trade Consortium, now hiring Earth humans." Jack got in line. He didn't know why. He just felt like he had to try. The line moved slowly. Jack spent 4 hours waiting. He talked to the people around him. There was a woman named Dr. Patricia Miller who had 3 college degrees. She studied brains and how they worked. There was a man named Colonel Ryan Hayes who had been in the Air Force for 20 years. He had flown fighter jets and commanded hundreds of soldiers. Everyone in line seemed smarter than Jack. They talked about science and math and things Jack didn't understand. He almost left the line twice, but something made him stay. Finally, Jack reached the front of the line. A security guard checked his driver's license and gave him a number. "Report to Building C tomorrow at 8 in the morning," the guard said. Bring identification and be prepared to spend the whole day. Jack drove home with the paper in his pocket. He told Maria about the line and the appointment. She was worried but supportive. What if they don't want me? Jack asked. What if they do? Maria replied. The next morning, Jack put on his best clothes and drove to the dome. Building C was inside the main structure. Jack had never seen anything like it. The walls were smooth and white. The floors seemed to glow with soft light. Everything was perfectly clean. Jack followed signs to a large room filled with chairs. There were about 200 people there. Some he recognized from the line the day before. Dr. Miller was sitting in the front row, reading a thick book. Colonel Hayes was talking to a group of men who looked like they were also military. Jack found an empty chair in the back row. He sat down and looked around. Everyone seemed nervous but excited. People were checking their phones and talking quietly about what might happen. At exactly 8 o'clock, the room went silent. A door opened at the front of the room and 3 figures walked in. They were tall, much taller than humans. Their skin was blue and they had 4 arms instead of 2. Their eyes were large and seemed to look in all directions at once. The alien in the center stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was strange but understandable. Welcome, humans of Earth. I am the one you may call Director Blue. We are Zephyrians, and we represent the Galactic Trade Consortium. We have come to your planet to offer employment opportunities that will benefit both our species. Jack listened carefully. Director Blue explained that they needed workers for deep space mining operations. The work involved traveling to distant asteroid fields and extracting valuable minerals. The trips were long, sometimes lasting months, or even years. The work is not physically demanding, Director Blue continued. Our machines do most of the heavy labor, but the job requires mental strength. Workers must be able to handle long periods of isolation and boredom. Many beings in our galaxy cannot cope with such conditions. The alien explained that humans had qualities that made them valuable for this work. They were adaptable and resourceful. They could handle stress and uncertainty better than most species. The compensation is substantial, Director Blue said. Each worker will receive $1 million Earth dollars for a 2-year contract. There are opportunities for advancement and additional contracts. The room buzzed with excitement. Jack felt his heart beating faster. $1 million would change everything for his family. However, Director Blue continued, we can only select the most suitable candidates. The testing process will be thorough and challenging. Not everyone will be chosen. The alien looked around the room, its large eyes seeming to study each person. The testing begins now, Director Blue announced. Follow the blue lights to the next room. Jack stood up with everyone else. His hands were shaking slightly. He had no idea what the aliens were looking for, but he was determined to try his best. As he walked toward the blue lights, he thought about Maria and the kids. He thought about the $1 million. He thought about the chance to do something important, even if he didn't fully understand what it was. The blue lights led to an even larger room. This one was completely white and empty except for 200 plastic chairs arranged in neat rows. Jack found a chair and sat down. He looked around at the other candidates. They all looked nervous and excited. Director Blue appeared at the front of the room again. The first test begins now, the alien said. You will demonstrate your ability to handle the mental challenges of deep space work. Jack took a deep breath and waited to see what would happen next. Director Blue stood at the front of the white room and looked at all 200 candidates. The alien's 4 arms moved in strange patterns as it spoke. Jack noticed that the other aliens were taking notes on glowing tablets that floated in the air. This test will measure your ability to handle the mental challenges of deep space work, Director Blue said. Space travel involves long periods of waiting. Sometimes workers must sit for weeks with nothing to do while traveling between mining sites. Many beings cannot handle such periods of inactivity. Jack shifted in his plastic chair. It was not comfortable, but he had sat in worse chairs during his construction days. He looked around at the other candidates. Dr. Miller was sitting straight up with her hands folded. Colonel Hayes looked ready for action, his back rigid like he was still in the military. "The rules are simple," Director Blue continued. "You must remain seated in your chair. You cannot talk to other candidates. You cannot use any electronic devices. You cannot read books or papers. You cannot write or draw. You can only sit and wait." A woman near the front raised her hand. "For how long?" she asked. "The test will end when it ends," Director Blue replied. "Workers in space do not always know when their waiting will be over. This is part of what you must learn to accept." Jack felt his stomach drop. He had no idea how long this would take. What if it was all day? What if it was longer? He thought about Maria and the kids. He hoped they wouldn't worry if he came home late. "If you need to leave the test, raise your hand and you will be escorted out," Director Blue said. "But once you leave, you cannot return. Your chance to work for the Galactic Trade Consortium will be over." The alien gestured to the floating tablets. "My assistants will be watching and recording your behavior. We will note everything you do and how you react to the waiting. This information will help us decide who is suitable for deep space work." Director Blue and the other aliens left the room. The door closed with a soft sound. Jack looked around. The room was completely quiet except for the sound of people breathing and shifting in their chairs. At first, Jack tried to count the ceiling tiles. There were too many, and he lost track after 50. He looked at his watch, but then remembered. He wasn't supposed to use electronic devices. He wondered if a watch counted as an electronic device, so he decided not to look at it again. The woman sitting next to Jack was young, maybe 25 years old. She looked like she had never done physical work in her life. Her hands were soft and clean. She was wearing expensive clothes and jewelry. After what felt like 30 minutes, she started tapping her foot quietly. Jack recognized some of the people from the line yesterday. There was Lisa Wong, who had told everyone she was a computer programmer. She had designed programs for big companies and made a lot of money. Now she was staring at the ceiling and moving her lips like she was talking to herself. Greg Thompson was sitting 3 rows ahead of Jack. He had been in the Navy for 10 years and worked on submarines. He had said that submarines were like spaceships because they were closed and isolated. Now Greg was doing something with his hands under his chair. Jack couldn't see what it was, but Greg's shoulders were moving like he was doing exercises. Jack tried to remember what Director Blue had said about the job. Workers would travel to asteroid fields to mine valuable minerals. The trips could last months or years. Jack had never been away from his family for more than a few days. The thought of being away for months made him feel sad and scared, but then he thought about the $1 million. He thought about Carlos and Sofia going to college. He thought about Maria not having to work 2 jobs anymore. He thought about buying a house with a yard where the kids could play. Time passed slowly. Jack's back started to hurt from the plastic chair. He had learned to deal with uncomfortable chairs during his construction days. Sometimes he had to sit and wait for hours while inspectors checked his work. Sometimes he had to wait for materials to be delivered. Construction work involved a lot of waiting. Jack discovered that he could make himself more comfortable by shifting his weight slightly. He found a position where his back didn't hurt as much. He let his shoulders relax. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath around him. Other candidates were getting more restless. Dr. Miller was now rubbing her temples like she had a headache. Her book was still in her lap, but she couldn't read it according to the rules. She kept looking at it like she wanted to grab it and start reading. Colonel Hayes was sitting like a statue, but Jack could see the tension in his face. The colonel's jaw was clenched tight. His hands were balled into fists. He looked like he was fighting an internal battle to stay still. Lisa Wong was having the hardest time. She was used to being busy all the time. Her fingers were moving like she was typing on an invisible keyboard. She kept looking around the room like she was searching for something to do. Her leg was bouncing up and down nervously. Jack realized that his construction background might actually help him. He was used to taking breaks when he could get them. During lunch breaks, he would often just sit and relax. He didn't always need to be doing something. Sometimes the best thing to do was nothing at all. The young woman next to Jack was getting more agitated. She kept checking her fingernails and adjusting her hair. She looked at her expensive watch every few minutes. Jack could see that she was struggling with the boredom. More time passed. Jack wasn't sure how much. Without being able to look at his watch, he had no way to know. But his stomach was starting to rumble, so he guessed it had been several hours. He wondered if the aliens would give them food or water. Some candidates were starting to crack. A man in the front row raised his hand. One of the alien assistants came and escorted him out of the room. He looked relieved to be leaving. 5 minutes later, another person left. Then another watched people leave and wondered if he should quit too. This was harder than he had expected. Not because it was physically difficult, but because the uncertainty was stressful. Not knowing how long the test would last made every minute feel longer, but Jack had experience with uncertainty. Construction work was unpredictable. Sometimes projects were delayed by weather or problems with materials. Sometimes he would show up to work and find out the job had been canceled. He had learned to deal with not knowing what would happen next. Jack let his mind wander. He thought about his childhood in Las Vegas. He remembered playing in the desert with his friends. He remembered his father teaching him to use tools. He remembered meeting Maria at a church dance when they were both 18. The memories made him feel calmer. He realized that he didn't need to be actively thinking about the test. He could just let his mind drift and the time would pass. This was something he had learned during long days of physical labor. Sometimes the best way to get through boring work was to let your mind go somewhere else. Dr. Miller was now visibly struggling. She was rocking back and forth slightly in her chair. Her education and intelligence weren't helping her with this test. In fact, her busy mind seemed to be making it harder for her to sit still and do nothing. Colonel Hayes was still sitting at attention, but Jack could see sweat on his forehead. The colonel was used to action and orders. He was used to having missions and objectives. This purposeless waiting was torture for someone trained to always be ready for action. Lisa Wong suddenly stood up and raised her hand. She couldn't take it anymore. An alien assistant came and led her out of the room. She looked embarrassed and defeated. Jack felt sorry for her. She was probably very good at her job, but this test was different from anything she had experienced. Jack settled deeper into his chair. He was starting to understand something important. This test wasn't about intelligence or education or military training. It was about something else entirely. It was about being comfortable with emptiness and boredom. It was about not needing constant stimulation or activity. Jack closed his eyes and let himself relax completely. For the first time since the test began, he felt almost peaceful. He thought about Maria and smiled. She would be proud of him for trying something new and challenging. The test continued, and Jack waited. Jack opened his eyes and looked around the room. Many chairs were empty now. He counted quickly and saw that about half the candidates had left. The ones who remained looked tired and stressed. Some were fidgeting in their seats. Others were staring at the walls with blank expressions. Dr. Miller was still in her chair, but she looked terrible. Her perfect hair was messy now. She was muttering under her breath, talking to herself about brain chemistry and stress responses. Jack could hear her whispering about dopamine and serotonin. Her education was turning into a curse because she knew too much about what was happening to her mind. Colonel Hayes was still sitting straight, but his face was red. Sweat was dripping down his forehead. His hands were shaking slightly. Jack could see that the colonel was fighting every instinct in his body. Military training had taught him to be ready for action at all times. This forced stillness was against everything he had learned. The young woman next to Jack was gone. She had left about an hour ago, crying as she walked out. Jack felt bad for her. She had probably never faced anything like this before. Her comfortable life had not prepared her for this kind of challenge. Jack shifted in his chair and found a new, comfortable position. During his construction days, he had learned to sleep anywhere. Sometimes he would take naps during lunch breaks, sitting in uncomfortable chairs or even leaning against walls. His body had adapted to finding rest in difficult conditions. He closed his eyes again and let his mind drift. He thought about the time he had to wait 6 hours for a building inspector to show up. He had sat in his truck most of the day, just waiting. At first, he had been frustrated. But then he had learned to use the time to rest and think. Jack began to doze off. His head tilted to one side, and his breathing became slower and deeper. He wasn't fully asleep, but he was close. His body was relaxed, but his mind was still alert enough to wake up if something happened. The aliens were watching him closely. They moved their floating tablets closer to Jack's chair. They seemed fascinated by his ability to find rest in such an uncomfortable situation. One of them made clicking sounds that might have been alien communication. Greg Thompson was having a harder time. The former Navy man was used to discipline and routine. On submarines, every minute was scheduled. There was always something to do, some task to complete. This emptiness was driving him crazy. He started doing mental exercises, trying to remember the names of everyone he had served with. A man named Peter Davis was sitting 2 rows in front of Jack. He was a lawyer who had worked on complicated cases for 20 years. He was used to his mind being busy all the time. Now he was trying to organize invisible legal documents in his head. His lips were moving as he reviewed imaginary contracts. Jack woke up from his light sleep when he heard someone crying. It was Dr. Miller. The brilliant scientist was having a breakdown. She was talking about sensory deprivation and psychological torture. Her knowledge of the human brain was making her experience worse, not better. "This is inhumane," Dr. Miller whispered. "The human mind needs stimulation. We need input and activity. This is causing psychological damage." Jack felt sorry for her. She was probably right about the science, but her knowledge wasn't helping her cope. Sometimes knowing too much about a problem made it harder to deal with. More people left. A computer programmer named Steve Kim raised his hand and walked out. He looked relieved to be escaping. An engineer named Nancy Brown followed a few minutes later. She was shaking as she left the room. Jack realized that the people who were leaving were mostly the ones with the best jobs and the most education. They were used to being busy and productive. Their minds were trained to always be working on problems. This forced inactivity was torture for them. The aliens continued to watch and take notes. They seemed especially interested in the candidates who were struggling the most. Jack wondered if the aliens had expected this to happen. Maybe they knew that smart, successful people would have the hardest time with this test. Colonel Hayes suddenly stood up and began pacing back and forth next to his chair. He wasn't leaving, but he couldn't sit still anymore. One of the aliens approached him. "You must remain seated," the alien said in its strange voice. "I am remaining in my designated area," Colonel Hayes replied. "I am not leaving the test." The alien made more clicking sounds and returned to its tablet. Jack could see that the colonel was trying to find a way to stay in the test while still moving. But after a few minutes, the alien returned. "Sitting is required," the alien said firmly. Colonel Hayes looked frustrated and angry. He sat back down, but his whole body was tense. Jack could see that the colonel wouldn't last much longer. His military training was working against him. Jack dozed off again. This time he had a dream about his father. In the dream, they were working together on a construction site. His father was showing him how to mix concrete. It was a peaceful dream, and Jack felt happy and relaxed when he woke up. More chairs were empty. Colonel Hayes was gone. So was Dr. Miller. Jack looked around and counted only about 60 people left. The test had been going on for what felt like a very long time. Jack's stomach was rumbling loudly now. He was hungry and thirsty. But he had worked construction jobs where lunch was delayed for hours. He had learned to ignore hunger and thirst when necessary. This was just another form of discomfort that he could handle. A woman named Jennifer Liu was sitting across from Jack. She was a doctor who had gone to medical school for 8 years. She was used to making important decisions and saving lives. Now she was rocking back and forth in her chair, humming quietly to herself. Her mind was desperately trying to create some kind of stimulation. Greg Thompson was still there, but he looked terrible. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. He was doing math problems in his head, trying to keep his mind busy. Jack could see him counting on his fingers under his chair. Jack stretched his legs slightly and adjusted his position. He discovered that he could make himself even more comfortable. He leaned back in the chair and let his arms hang loose. He felt like he could sit there for hours more if needed. The aliens were very interested in Jack now. Two of them were standing near his chair, watching him closely. They were making clicking and whistling sounds to each other. Jack wondered what they were saying about him. Peter Davis, the layer, suddenly started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from stress and frustration. He was looking at his hands like they were foreign objects. His mind was starting to break down from the lack of stimulation. Jack felt bad for all these smart, successful people. They had probably never failed at anything in their lives. They were used to being the best at everything they tried. This test was showing them that intelligence and education weren't always enough. More people left. Jennifer Liu raised her hand and walked out. She looked embarrassed and defeated. A man named Robert Clark followed her. He was an accountant who had worked with numbers his whole life. His mind needed problems to solve, and this test gave him nothing. Jack realized that he had an advantage that none of these other people had. He was used to being bored. Construction work involved a lot of waiting and downtime. He had learned to be comfortable with emptiness and inactivity. His simple life had prepared him for this test in a way that no amount of education could. The room was much quieter now. Only about 30 people remained. Jack looked around at the survivors. Most of them looked exhausted and stressed. Some were muttering to themselves. Others were staring at nothing with blank expressions. Jack closed his eyes and dozed off again. He dreamed about Maria and the kids. In the dream, they were all sitting together in a new house with a big yard. Carlos and Sofia were playing on expensive toys. Maria was smiling and looked happy and relaxed. When Jack woke up, he felt refreshed. The dream had been so real that he felt like he had actually spent time with his family. He looked around the room and saw that even more people had left. The test was getting harder, but Jack was getting more comfortable. He settled back in his chair and waited to see what would happen next. Jack woke up from another light sleep and stretched his arms. He felt surprisingly good, like he had just taken a refreshing nap. Around him, the room looked very different. Most of the chairs were empty now. Jack counted only about 20 people left. The survivors looked like they had been through a war. Greg Thompson was still there, but his face was pale and his hands were shaking badly. He was talking to himself about submarine procedures, trying to keep his mind busy. His Navy training was no longer helping him. It was making things worse. Peter Davis, the layer, was rocking back and forth in his chair. His expensive suit was wrinkled and sweaty. He kept checking his empty pockets like he was looking for his phone. His eyes were red and watery. He looked like he might cry at any moment. A woman named Sandra White was sitting in the front row. She was a yoga instructor who taught meditation classes. Jack had thought she would be good at this test, but she was struggling too. She kept trying to do breathing exercises, but her breath was shaky and uneven. Even her meditation training couldn't help her with this kind of forced stillness. Jack looked at his watch and realized the test had been going on for 8 hours. 8 hours of just sitting and waiting. He felt proud of himself for lasting this long. Most of the smart, educated people had given up hours ago. The aliens were moving around the room more now. They seemed excited about something. 3 of them were standing near Jack's chair, watching him closely. They were making clicking sounds and moving their forearms in complex patterns. Jack wondered if they were talking about him. Director Blue appeared in the room again. The tall alien walked slowly between the remaining chairs, looking at each candidate carefully. When Director Blue reached Jack's chair, the alien stopped and stared at him for a long time. Jack tried to sit up straighter, but the alien made a gesture that seemed to say, "Stay relaxed." Greg Thompson couldn't take it anymore. He stood up suddenly and raised his hand. "I need to leave," he said in a shaky voice. "I can't do this anymore." An alien assistant came and escorted him out. Greg looked back at Jack with confusion, like he couldn't understand how Jack was still sitting there calmly. More people left over the next hour. Sandra White gave up, tears streaming down her face. She had spent years teaching people how to find inner peace, but this test had broken her. Peter Davis left without saying anything. He just stood up and walked out like he was in a trance. Jack was starting to feel like he was in a different world. The room was so quiet now that he could hear his own heartbeat. Only 12 people remained. He looked around at the other survivors. Most of them looked terrible. Their faces were red and sweaty. Some were mumbling to themselves. Others were staring at the walls with blank expressions, but Jack felt fine. Better than fine, actually. He had been cycling between light sleep and relaxed wakefulness for hours. Each time he dozed off, he felt more rested. This was different from the exhaustion he saw in the other candidates. A man named Tony Rodriguez was sitting 3 chairs away from Jack. He was a mechanic who fixed cars for a living. Tony had lasted longer than most of the educated candidates, but now he was struggling too. His hands were moving like he was working on an invisible engine. His mind needed something to fix, something to do with his hands. Jack realized that even Tony, who had a working-class job like him, was having trouble, but Tony was used to being busy with his hands. He was used to solving mechanical problems. Jack's construction work had been different. There had been many times when he just had to wait. Wait for inspections, wait for materials, wait for weather to clear. A woman named Angela Moore was the last other person who seemed calm. She was a librarian who spent her days in quiet places, but even she was starting to crack. She was mouthing words like she was reading an invisible book. Her mind was searching for stories and information that wasn't there. Jack dozed off again. This time he dreamed about the asteroid fields that Director Blue had mentioned. In his dream, he was floating in space, looking at glittering rocks full of valuable minerals. The dream was peaceful and beautiful. When he woke up, he felt excited about the possibility of actually seeing such things. The aliens were very interested in Jack now. 5 of them were gathered around his chair, making soft clicking sounds. They seemed amazed by his ability to sleep in such an uncomfortable situation. One of them touched his floating tablet, and Jack saw his image appear on the screen. Tony Rodriguez raised his hand and left the test. He looked frustrated and angry with himself. As he walked past Jack, he whispered, "How are you doing this, man?" Jack just smiled and nodded. He didn't really know how to explain it. Angela Moore lasted another hour before she gave up. She was the last woman in the room. When she left, only 8 people remained. Jack looked around at the other survivors. They all looked like they were barely holding on. A man named Kevin Park was an artist who painted pictures for a living. He had lasted longer than Jack expected, but now his hands were moving like he was painting in the air. His creative mind was desperately trying to create something, anything, to occupy itself. Another man named Danny Walsh was a construction worker like Jack, but Danny did electrical work, which required more concentration and problem solving. He was sitting with his eyes closed, but Jack could see tension in his face. Danny was trying to wire imaginary buildings in his head. Jack felt sorry for all of them. They were fighting against their own minds, trying to force themselves to be still and empty. Jack wasn't fighting anything. He was just being himself. The same person who could sit in his truck for hours waiting for work to start. The same person who could take naps on uncomfortable chairs during lunch breaks. The test continued. Kevin Park left after trying to paint invisible pictures in the air for 30 minutes. Danny Walsh lasted another hour before admitting defeat. His electrical mind needed circuits and problems to solve. Now only 5 people remained. Jack looked around at the others. They all looked like they were barely alive. Their faces were pale and sweaty. Some were shaking. Others were mumbling nonsense to themselves. A man named Carlos Mendez was a farmer who grew vegetables. He had survived longer than most people, but farming was about seasons and cycles. Even farmers needed to plant and harvest. This complete inactivity was foreign to him. He raised his hand and left with a look of confusion on his face. 4 people left, then 3. Then 2. Jack and 1 other person remained. The other survivor was a man named Paul Chun. He was a security guard who worked night shifts at office buildings. Paul was used to long, quiet hours with nothing to do. But even he was struggling now. His eyes were darting around the room like he was looking for threats that weren't there. Jack felt completely relaxed. He had found the perfect position in his chair. His breathing was slow and steady. He felt like he could sit there for days if needed. The aliens were all watching him. Now, making excited clicking sounds. Paul Chun suddenly stood up and screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain or fear. It was a scream of pure frustration. He had reached his breaking point. The security guard who was used to boring nights had been defeated by the ultimate boredom. He raised his hand and left the room, shaking. His head in disbelief. Jack was alone. He looked around the empty room and felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had outlasted everyone. All the doctors and lawyers and engineers and military officers. All the smart, successful people who had thought they were better than a simple construction worker. The aliens were all gathered around him now. They were making excited sounds and gesturing with their 4 arms. Jack could tell they were amazed by what they had witnessed. He had done something that none of them had expected. Director Blue approached Jack's chair. The tall alien looked down at him with those large, multifaceted eyes. "Congratulations, Jack Martinez," Director Blue said. "You have passed the first test. But more importantly, you have shown us something remarkable about your species." Jack smiled. He felt proud but also curious. He wanted to know what the aliens had learned from watching him sit in a chair for 12 hours. "What happens now?" Jack asked. "Now," Director Blue replied, "we explain why you succeeded where others failed, and we offer you a job that will change your life forever." Director Blue stood in front of Jack and made clicking sounds to the other aliens. They all moved closer, their large eyes studying Jack like he was the most interesting thing they had ever seen. Jack felt a little uncomfortable with all the attention, but he tried to stay calm. "Jack Martinez," Director Blue said, "you have accomplished something that surprises us greatly. In all our years of testing different species across the galaxy, we have never seen anything like what you just did." Jack shifted in his chair. "I just sat here. I don't understand what's so special about that." Director Blue made a sound that might have been alien laughter. "You did much more than just sit. You demonstrated an ability that is extremely rare. In the universe, let me explain what we have learned." The alien gestured to one of the floating tablets. Images appeared in the air above it. Jack saw pictures of different alien species from across the galaxy. Some looked like giant insects. Others looked like floating jellyfish. Some were covered in fur or scales. "Every intelligent species in the galaxy has the same problem," Director Blue continued. "Our brains are designed to be active. We need constant stimulation and purpose. When we have nothing to do, our minds become restless and anxious. This is especially true for the most intelligent beings." Jack thought about Dr. Miller and Colonel Hayes. They were both very smart and successful, but they had broken down during the test. Their intelligence had actually made things harder for them. "Space travel requires long periods of inactivity," Director Blue explained. "When we travel between star systems, there are weeks or months with nothing to do. Most species need expensive entertainment systems, virtual reality environments, and constant mental stimulation to prevent psychological breakdown." The alien showed Jack images of massive spaceships filled with entertainment facilities. There were movie theaters, game rooms, virtual reality chambers, and recreation areas. The ships looked more like luxury hotels than mining vessels. "These entertainment systems are extremely expensive," Director Blue said. "They require enormous amounts of energy and space. They also break down frequently and need constant maintenance. Most mining operations barely make a profit because of these costs." Jack was starting to understand. The aliens needed workers who didn't require expensive entertainment. They needed people who could handle boredom without going crazy. "But humans are different," Director Blue continued. "Your species evolved a unique survival trait. During your primitive past, you needed to conserve energy during long hunts and while hiding from predators. You develop the ability to power down your consciousness while remaining alert to danger. Jack thought about his construction days. He remembered taking naps during lunch breaks, but always waking up when someone called his name or when he heard unusual sounds. His body could rest while his mind stayed partially awake. Most humans have lost this ability through modern lifestyle, Director Blue said. Your cities are full of constant noise and stimulation. Your technology keeps your minds busy all the time, but some humans like you have retained this ancient skill. The alien showed Jack brain scans on the floating tablet. While you were sleeping in your chair, we were monitoring your brain activity. You were not fully unconscious like normal sleep. Instead, you entered a state of restful awareness that we have never seen in any other species. Jack felt amazed. He had never thought of his ability to nap anywhere as special. It was just something he had learned to do because his job required it. Your working-class background preserved this ability, Director Blue explained. Physical labor involves periods of waiting and rest. You learn to be comfortable with inactivity. The educated candidates could not do this because their minds are trained to always be busy. Jack thought about all the smart people who had left the test. Their education and intelligence had actually worked against them. They couldn't turn off their brains when they needed to. This makes you incredibly valuable for space work, Director Blue said. You can travel for months without needing entertainment systems. You can handle the isolation and boredom that drives other beings insane. You are exactly what we have been searching for. Jack felt proud but also nervous. What kind of work would I be doing? Director Blue gestured to another image. Jack saw massive spaceships approaching asteroid fields. The asteroids glittered with valuable minerals and metals. Deep space mining involves traveling to distant asteroid fields and extracting rare materials, the alien explained. The work itself is not difficult. Our machines do most of the heavy labor, but the journeys can take months or even years. Workers must be able to handle long periods with nothing to do. Jack saw images of mining operations. Huge machines were drilling into asteroids and extracting glowing crystals. The work looked dangerous but also exciting. He had never imagined he would have a chance to see such things. The compensation reflects the difficulty of finding suitable workers, Director Blue said. Each contract pays 1 million Earth dollars for 2 years of service. Workers who prove themselves can earn additional contracts with higher pay and leadership positions. Jack's heart raced. $1 million would change everything for his family. Carlos and Sofia could go to any college they wanted. Maria could quit her second job. They could buy a house with a yard and never worry about money again. But I don't have any education, Jack said. I dropped out of high school. I don't know anything about space or mining. Education can be provided, Director Blue replied. Technical skills can be taught, but the mental ability you demonstrated today cannot be learned. It is either present or it is not. You have shown that you possess this rare gift. Jack thought about his family. He thought about the $1 million. He thought about traveling through space and seeing things that no human had ever seen before. What about my family? Jack asked. I would be away for 2 years. Communication with Earth is possible during certain phases of the journey, Director Blue said. You would be able to send messages to your family. And the financial security you provide will give them a much better life while you are gone. Jack imagined calling Maria to tell her about the job offer. She would be shocked but proud. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. There is one more thing you should know, Director Blue said. You will not be working alone. We are selecting other humans for our mining operations, but they will come from backgrounds similar to yours. People who have retained the ability to handle boredom and isolation. Jack felt relieved. He wouldn't be the only human in space. There would be others who understood what it was like to work with their hands and wait when necessary. Do you accept our offer, Jack Martinez? Director Blue asked. Jack thought about everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, he had been an unemployed construction worker with no prospects. Now he was being offered a chance to earn more money than he had ever dreamed of and to have adventures beyond his imagination. "Yes," Jack said, "I accept." Director Blue made clicking sounds that seemed happy. The other aliens moved their arms in patterns that looked like celebration. "Excellent," Director Blue said. "You will begin training immediately. Your first mission will depart in 3 months. Welcome to the Galactic Trade Consortium, Jack Martinez." Jack stood up from his chair. For the first time in 12 hours. His legs were a little stiff, but he felt good. He felt proud of himself for lasting through the test and excited about his new future. As he walked out of the testing room, Jack thought about calling Maria. She wouldn't believe what had happened. Their simple life was about to become an incredible adventure. Jack Martinez, the construction worker who had learned to sleep anywhere, was about to become the first human deep space miner. His ability to find peace in emptiness and comfort in boredom had opened doors to opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. The aliens had been searching the galaxy for workers who could handle the loneliness of space. They had found their answer. In the most unlikely place, in a man who had learned patience and rest through years of hard, simple work. Jack smiled as he walked toward his new life among the stars.